the Liberty Podcast with Clint Armitage. We are proclaiming liberty one show at a time, and the next one starts right now. Hey, how's it going? It's Clint Armitage with the Liberty Podcast, and we are now into part 2 of the episodes entitled Be Strong and Courageous. So in the first episode, we were talking about Joshua and how he needed a pep talk from God, and he got that pep talk. And now we're going to be looking at what he did with that pep talk, the decisions he made, how he handled it, and kind of the steps he went through. So after the Israelites passed through the Jordan River, immediately they were met with their first battle. And it was in, when they crossed over into Canaan, their first battle in the Promised Land. And it was the city of Jericho. Now, the problem with Jericho is that it was a fortified city. And Jericho was it was a masterpiece. It was a marvel back then. It had an outer wall and an inner wall. So 2 walls that had to be defeated in order to get through and conquer the city. And those walls protected them from external attacks. So these walls were really, really thick and they were super high. And in some areas of the outer wall actually had dwellings built in them. If you remember later on in the book of Joshua, you'll if you read on into Rahab's section, remember she lived in the wall. It's actually something that is utilized today. It's called natural surveillance. When you're building, when you're setting up a building, a community, a shopping center, if you're doing anything like that, you want to take into account what's called natural surveillance. And natural surveillance is basically utilizing a design on the buildings, on the area, so that people can see all around. That's what you want. You want people to see not only like security guards or like in this case, soldiers on top of the wall, right? You had those guys that was their job to identify threats coming toward the city. So they'd be in the wall, on top of the wall, and they'd ID any type of potential threat coming towards the city. Well, by putting dwellings on the outer wall and with windows that faced outbound, you actually created natural surveillance. This is super smart. It's an awesome tactic because then the people living in the wall actually had eyes on the street, as it's called. They had eyes on the roads, eyes on the area around the city. So even if the guards or the soldiers even if they did not identify a threat coming their way, they had natural surveillance. They had other people with eyes on the road, eyes in the area that could identify potential threats that were missed. So more eyes are on the area just by placing these dwellings within the outer wall and with a window facing outbound. So, that's actually pretty cool how they had those tactics back then, how they designed things back then with military strategy. So it's pretty awesome. Okay, so the city was properly constructed, okay? Like I said, super thick walls, super high walls, and there was 2 walls, right? It was created to defend itself from an advantageous position. So really, the only thing you could do, you couldn't really break into the city. The only way you could really take the city is by sieging it, by basically surrounding it and waiting it out, because you couldn't climb the walls because at the top of the walls, the soldiers would just beat you down. And you couldn't break through the walls because it was super thick and super high. So really the only way, you had to have a lot of resources in your army, and resources meaning you can hang for longer than them. Like if you actually read into this story here where Joshua and the Israelites conquer Jericho, in an archaeological dig, the one that discovered Jericho, what they found was in a ton of the dwellings within the city of Jericho, there were full vessels of grain, a lot of full vessels of grain. So what that tells us is that they were prepared to be sieged, because their vessels were full of grain. If they weren't prepared and it was just a kind of a thing where they got surprised, then the vessels wouldn't all be full. But in the archaeological dig and find, they discovered that these vessels were actually full of grain. There was a ton of vessels in each dwelling that had full grain. They were full with grain. So that means they were prepared for a siege. They saw the Israelites coming. And of course, they did. In the Bible, it tells us that they knew that Israel was coming their way. And that's why they were afraid, like Rahab said, that they were afraid when they were en route. So it's kind of cool how the archaeology, the dig, the find, actually supports what the Bible says. So it's pretty awesome how God does that. He makes sure that these things are eventually found and people start making the connection like, oh, the Bible is true. So anyways, the city was a fortified city that you really couldn't, break into. It was very, very difficult. You really had to only siege it, and you had to have a lot of resources to be able to do that. And they were prepared too to last a long time if there were siege, because they believed they were going to be sieged in this case here. And so, getting back to Joshua, now he was a military strategist, right? We knew he'd experienced leading battles for Moses. He was like the general. He was the one that Moses told to go to war, and they basically went to war under Joshua. So Joshua was like the general. He's the military strategist. But more than that, he actually trusted God for his victories. In the past, the only one that they really didn't win was the Battle of Ai, and that's because they didn't listen to God. And it wasn't Joshua; it was one of the guys there. There was just a problem with not following God's instructions about the spoils of war. And anyways, so they lied. He lied to God. One of the soldiers lied to God, and next thing you know, God did not allow them to win their next battle at Ai. So anyways, but Joshua, he trusted God. Remember, he was one of the 2 spies that came back and said, hey, this land is great, when they went to first spy out Canaan with 12 of the tribes' leaders. The 12 spies from the tribes got sent by Moses to spy out the land initially before they had to walk through the wilderness and get cursed and walk through the wilderness for 40 years. Well, it was Joshua and Caleb that came back and said, yeah, man, there's big dudes over there, but let's take them. God is bigger. But the other 10 did not say that, and so they did not go, and that's why they were punished and didn't get to cross into the promised land. Not that generation. God let that generation die off before leading them into the promised land. And it was Joshua that did it because of his faithfulness. So anyways, he trusted God for his victories in the past. And now he continued to listen to God and obey him. And that's the key, right? Key to a winning streak. To win is to be able to obey God, because God cannot lose. He will not lose. There is no way. The only time we lose is when we don't listen to God, or that's the way God wants it so that we learn something from it, right? Because we actually learn more when we lose than when we win. So they just experienced this huge miracle by crossing the Jordan River, the flooded river. God parted the river, so they walked through. So sometimes what happens is we can get on these highs after a big victory. And then after that, we temporarily kind of let go of Jesus's hand or God's hand, or we start disbelieving, not believing in ourselves and God, and we lose our confidence. Kind of like Elijah when he was on Mount Carmel and he beat the 450 priests of Baal or Baal. And then right after that, he's scared of Jezebel, because Jezebel says she's gonna kill him. And then he starts running and he's scared. Right after he did this huge miracle, multiple miracles at Mount Carmel. And so I guess sometimes when we get this big victory, sometimes we temporarily, lose it a little bit, and we let go of God's hand and his lead because we feel we can do anything sometimes. And then we find out, oh my gosh, we can't do this on our own. So whatever it is, pride or complacency or whatever it is, we've got to stop being comfortable and basking in our victories of the past, right? We got to keep, God's hand. We got to keep following God in this all the way into the future, and we got to keep doing that in order to keep winning and doing things that he wants us to do. Because if he wants us to win, it's going to happen. And if he wants us to learn something when we lose, it's going to happen like that. But we just have to hold on to God. We got to follow Jesus's lead. Even if it's temporary, we have to do the best we can to do that. Otherwise, we're going to falter, and we don't want to do that all the time. Okay, so let's think about this situation here. We've got Joshua, right, who's faced with this battle against this fortified city. Now, what's your first tactical thought if you wanted to get into the city? Now, mine was figuring out how to bypass this fortification. When I pondered the strategy, I could only come up with things that related to finding a way over, under, around, or kind of trying to find a weak point in the wall. Or, I don't know, just like climbing the face or using deception to get in the front door, that kind of thing. But this is where Joshua actually shines as a military strategist. He doesn't immediately think tactical strategy. He actually thinks dependence and prayerful obedience. And that is when God, the creator of the universe, gives him the tactical strategy to defeat the fortification, which is, another supernatural event on its own. Because no one could even have imagined, right? March around the city for 6 days, then 7 times march around the city on the 7th day, and then the wall's going to come crashing down. And that's how the Israelites were able to walk right in and conquer the city with ease. Now, this way of handling it delivered a huge blow to the people of Jericho because they're not prepared for that kind of entrance. They think that they're going to, be able to hold on through the siege because they think that's the only way it's going to happen is the siege because they can't break through the wall. But they didn't know that God was going to be in this, right? And the second thing is they are scared and confused when this happens. When the wall comes crashing down, they are scared, they're confused, which is, makes it a lot easier to conquer people when they're confused and they're scared. The third thing is when the people are surprised and they're overwhelmed, it takes the fight out of them. So instead of thinking tactically and strategizing through difficult situations, leadership dilemmas and all that stuff, let's start being God dependent and prayerfully obedient, just like Joshua. Then, maybe God will be gracious enough to provide the answer that comes with a supernatural victory, like the victory at Jericho. Then we can easily walk over these walls rather than to try to fight through these walls because they're super thick and super high. Let's be like Joshua and trust God for our battles. Then God willing, we can win battle after battle continuously, just like Joshua did, because we're following God's plan and being dependent on Him, because obedience to God is the prelude to success and what He has for you. All right, my name is Clint Armitage. This is the Liberty Podcast. This was episode 2 or part 2 of the episode, Be Strong and Courageous. Hopefully you got something out of that. And if you're a leader, take that to heart. Follow God, prayerfully obedient to His will, and you will have victory after victory after victory. All right, until next time, my name is Clint Armitage. This is the Liberty Podcast. Stay safe, stay motivated, and keep seeking liberty. Thanks for joining us for another episode of the Liberty Podcast with Clint Armitage. If you want to get in touch, email us at info@clintarmitage.com.